Nurses who can't follow simple protocols don't belong in a teaching hospital. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before he signed his own arrest warrant. St. Michael's Hospital in Portland hums with fluorescent lights and the antiseptic bite of bleach on linoleum. The night shift exhales its own particular rhythm, slower than day, more deliberate, the kind of quiet that settles over a place when most people are sleeping. Natalie Hayes moves through the corridors at 11:19 p.m. with the economy of someone who wastes nothing. Not words. Not motion. Not attention. Her scrubs are navy blue, the pockets weighted with the small tools of her trade, penlight, trauma shears, a laminated card with 47 critical lab values printed in 8-point font. Other nurses notice things about her. The way she can start and fur in a rolling vein on the first stick without the usual fumbling and repositioning. The way she assesses trauma patients with a speed that seems incongruous with her quiet demeanor, her eyes moving across a monitor the way a fighter pilot reads instruments, gathering data, processing, deciding. She never raises her voice. She never has to. When Natalie says step back, people move. She has worked the night shift at St. Michael's for 8 months. The day shift knows her name. The residents fear her competence. The attending physicians call her for complications. Dr. Sarah Chen, who rotates through emergency medicine, once said to another nurse, "If I code and she's in the building, I want her." This is the kind of reputation that builds quietly, without fanfare, and it is the kind that certain men find deeply threatening. Her locker is in the staff room on the 3rd floor, tucked between the refrigerator that has not been cleaned since March and a bulletin board covered in pictures of co-workers' children. The locker door is plain grey metal, unremarkable. Inside, hanging on a hook above her spare scrubs, sits a pair of combat boots. Desert tan faded to grey. Size 9. The laces are still crusted with sand, particles caught in the weave from a place called Marjah, from a valley in Helmand province where the temperature climbs to 127 degrees and every shadow might contain the kind of problem that doesn't have a medical solution. She touches them once before her shift begins tonight, a ritual she has performed 247 times without variation. Her hand presses against the leather. Her eyes close. Then she closes the locker and walks to the nurse's station to check the board. Room 347 has a new admission. 78-year-old male, deaf from birth, transferred from a skilled nursing facility with abdominal distension and difficulty breathing. Chart notes indicate he communicates through American Sign Language. The name on the chart reads Walter Morrison. She has never heard of him. She reads the vitals, blood pressure holding at 134/82, oxygen saturation 94% on room air, heart rate 67 and steady, and makes a note to introduce herself before the evening medications. At 12:34 a.m., she pushes through the door to 347 and finds the man sitting upright in the hospital bed, watching the television with the sound off. He is thin in the way that old soldiers become thin, not weak, but economical, every calorie having been spent. His eyes are alert. The moment she enters, he looks at her and his expression shifts. Recognition. But of what, she does not yet know. She approaches the bedside and signs a greeting, a simple hello, her hands moving with the fluidity of someone who has used this language since childhood, the movements precise and unhurried. "I'm Natalie. I'll be your nurse tonight. How are you feeling?" Her voice is gentle, but her hands are military, each movement exact. The man's eyes fill with something. Not tears. Older than that. His hands move in response, and the signs are fast, emotional. Thank you, I didn't think," and she signs back, "It's okay." Slowly. "What's your name?" He spells it. Morrison. Not Walter. Wade. Wade Morrison. General Wade Morrison. She maintains her composure. Her hands are still. Her face does not change. But inside her chest, something shifts like continental plates grinding against each other. She knows this name the way a soldier knows a legend. The way people know the name of someone whose decisions kept them alive. She has a photograph, classified, burned, never supposed to exist, of a much younger Colonel Wade Morrison in the Marjah Valley, pointing at coordinates on a map, his voice giving orders that changed the shape of her life. "It's good to meet you, sir," she signs, and he watches her hands the way a man watches evidence of something he thought was impossible. "Let me check your vitals." She moves through the examination with professional precision, though her pulse has elevated to 89 beats per minute. Blood pressure stable. Lungs clear. Abdomen soft but with some fluid visible on the chart from today's ultrasound. The notes indicate possible congestive heart failure, possibly cardiac tamponade, though nothing has been confirmed. She documents her findings in the electronic chart and makes a note to check the billing codes. Room 347 is marked as a complex case. She will need to understand why. Dr. Whitfield arrives at 1:15 a.m. He moves through the ward with the particular swagger of a man who has never had to ask for anything twice. He is 54 years old, silver-haired, dressed in scrubs that cost more than a month of Natalie's rent. His watch is a Rolex Submariner, stainless steel, probably $8,000. He does not notice Natalie standing at the computer terminal reviewing the chart for room 347 until she looks up and their eyes meet for exactly 1.2 seconds. Something happens in that moment. Something primitive. He sees her competence. She sees him seeing it. And what she witnesses in his face is not admiration or respect. It is the expression of a man who has just recognized a threat to his authority, however small, however impossible that threat might seem. He is the attending physician. She is the nurse. The hierarchy is absolute. And yet. "Hayes," he says, his voice traveling across the nurse's station like a command. It is not a request for her attention. It is a declaration of dominance. Room 347. "I need you to assist with the admission assessment." "Of course, doctor," she says, and her voice is deferential, careful, exactly what he expects. She stands and follows him toward the room, her presence invisible, her competence carefully hidden. This is a skill she learned long ago, the art of making herself small in the presence of certain men. She has learned to move through the world as though she is not dangerous. As though her hands are ordinary. As though the things she has done, the places she has been, the weight she carries, none of it is real. They enter room 347 together. General Morrison is watching them approach. Whitfield moves to the bedside with the confident gait of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. He does not notice the way Morrison's expression becomes guarded. He does not notice the patient's hands tightening slightly on the bed sheet. "I'm Dr. Whitfield," he says, speaking to the patient as though volume might solve the problem of communication. "I'm going to examine you." "Natalie, get me the actually, never mind. I'll handle this." He turns to Morrison. "Can you speak? Or do we need an interpreter?" His tone suggests that being deaf is a minor inconvenience, the kind of thing that happens to other people. Natalie steps forward. "Sir, the patient communicates through ASL. I can interpret for you." Whitfield does not look at her. "I'm sure a basic examination won't require translation. Watch and learn, Hayes. Pay attention to the proper protocol." He places his stethoscope on Morrison's chest and listens for 4 seconds, then moves to listen to the abdomen, his movements efficient but lacking the carefulness that suggests any real concern. The examination takes 6 minutes. At no point does he ask Morrison a question. At no point does he attempt communication of any kind. When he finishes, he removes the stethoscope and says, without looking at either of them, "Fluid retention. Likely renal. We'll run an echo tomorrow morning. Natalie, you'll monitor his output and document everything." Everything. He emphasizes the word in a way that contains a threat wrapped in fabric so thin it barely qualifies as covering. Some nurses seem to have difficulty with simple protocols. Following orders. Staying in their lane. "I trust that won't be an issue here." "No, doctor," she says, and her voice is so soft it is almost invisible. "I understand." He leaves the room, and the door closes behind him with a whisper of hydraulics. The room is quiet except for the ventilator in the hall, the distant sound of an ambulance arriving at the emergency bay for floors below. General Morrison signs slowly, deliberately. "You're the one. The one from Marjah." It is not a question. His hands move with certainty, each sign a confirmation of something he has been waiting to find. She does not respond immediately. She checks the monitors. She documents the examination. She is very careful not to meet his eyes until she is certain her face reveals nothing. When she finally signs back, her movements are measured. "I'm a nurse, sir. That's all I am now." But the combat boots in her locker know better. The boots remember the sand. They remember the valley. They remember the woman she was, not in the way that movies remember, not in the way that songs remember. They remember in the way that objects remember, the way that spaces store up the weight of what has happened in them. And they are waiting. They are waiting for the moment when she stops being careful. When she stops being invisible. The night shift continues. Natalie moves through her rounds, her competence so absolute and so quiet that no one sees it. That is her gift. That is her curse. She makes everything look easy. She makes problems disappear. And in doing so, she becomes invisible in the way that all truly dangerous people learn to become invisible. But Whitfield saw her. For one moment, across the nurse's station at 1:15 a.m., he saw her competence and measured it against his own authority, and he did not like the equation that resulted. Grand rounds began at 7:30 in the morning, 15 residents trailing behind Dr. Whitfield like satellites locked in orbit. The elevator door slid open on the third floor and the procession moved toward room 347, their voices a low murmur that seemed to push the air ahead of them. Natalie was checking Morrison's vitals when Whitfield appeared in the doorway, his white coat still bearing the crease from his office closet, his stethoscope draped across his shoulders like a general's insignia. She didn't flinch. She nodded once in acknowledgement and continued documenting the blood pressure on the chart, 118/72, stable, normal for a man his age despite his condition. Whitfield gestured the residents inside. The room filled with bodies, with the smell of expensive cologne and the sharp scent of antiseptic that never quite disappeared from hospital walls. He moved to Morrison's bedside, his movements theatrical, every gesture designed to draw attention. Natalie stepped back into the corner, giving him space, becoming part of the furniture. "General Morrison here was admitted 3 days ago," Whitfield began, his voice carrying the particular cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Congestive heart failure, ejection fraction at 42%, stable on current diuretic therapy. Responding well to protocol." He paused, turning slightly, and Natalie felt the shift in the room's energy before his words arrived. "However, we have had an unusual situation. Nurse Hayes here has taken it upon herself to communicate with the patient using unauthorized methods." His eyes found her across the room, sharp as surgical instruments. "Tell me, Nurse Hayes, what medical school taught you that sign language was more important than following proper chain of command?" The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Natalie's jaw clenched so hard the muscle beneath her ear jumped, visible to anyone watching. Her hands remained perfectly still at her sides, thumbs aligned with her trouser seams, the posture she'd held during 1,000 briefings in 1,000 military debriefing rooms. The residents turned to look at her. She saw the smirks forming, the way their faces lit up with the primitive pleasure of watching someone put in their place. In a teaching hospital, Whitfield continued, warming to his audience now, "We maintain protocols for patient safety, not personal preference. When nurses start freelancing, when they decide their own interpretations of care supersede institutional guidelines, patients suffer. We all suffer." He gestured to the residents as if they were his children learning an important lesson about order. "The nurse's role is to execute, not to interpret. To follow, not to innovate. Yes, Nurse Hayes." "Yes, Doctor," she said, her voice level as a held note on a violin. Nothing in her face moved. No flush crept up her neck, no tremor visited her hands. She was a stone wall with eyes. The residents watched to see if she would break, and when she didn't, a strange disappointment seemed to settle over them like a fog. Whitfield held her gaze for 2 seconds longer than necessary, then turned back to Morrison, continuing his rounds as if she had already ceased to exist. The procession flowed out of the room, trailing behind him like water, and Natalie remained standing in the corner, her breathing controlled, her heart rate steady. She waited until their voices faded down the corridor before she moved. The afternoon came with a weight that hadn't been there before. Natalie had learned long ago that humiliation worked best when it was public and repetitive, when the subject was forced to witness others enjoying the spectacle. By 3 o'clock, the message had circulated through the hospital's informal network, the kind of network that moved faster than email, faster than official memo systems. Nurses whispered in the break room. Residents passed comment in the stairwell. The story had already started its transformation into legend, sign language Sally, playing hero with the deaf patient, getting dressed down by Whitfield in front of the entire teaching team. The vending machines on the 3rd floor hummed their mechanical song. Natalie inserted a dollar bill with deliberate precision, watching the bill disappear into the slot. 2 physicians stood 3 feet away, their voices carrying the careless volume of men who believed they occupied an exclusive space where normal rules of discretion didn't apply. "Did you see sign language Sally playing hero this morning?" One of them laughed, a resident with slicked back hair and the kind of smile that came from never being told no. Whitfield absolutely put her in her place. Next she'll be trying to diagnose the patients herself. The other physician, older, with reading glasses on a cord around his neck, chuckled. She looked terrified. I thought she was going to cry right there in front of everyone. Natalie's coffee fell into the machine's metal tray with a hollow clang. She picked it up, the cup warm against her palm, and turned. She passed them both without acknowledgement, her face constructed from the same material as stone, her eyes focused on a point somewhere beyond the hallway. The words dissolved in the air before they could touch her. She had survived worse than this, so much worse that casual cruelty barely registered on a scale she'd learned to measure in blood and shattered bone. These men were boys playing at authority in air-conditioned comfort. She had held a dying sergeant in Sanjan Valley while Taliban gunfire traced patterns across the wall behind her. She had watched friends drown in paperwork after classified operations went sideways. These words meant nothing. She returned to her station and pulled up the medication administration records for her other patients, her hands moving through the documentation with practiced efficiency. At 4:15, as her shift was winding down and the day nurses were arriving to take over, a shadow fell across her desk. The security guard, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of security guard mustache that suggested he watched action movies in his off hours, approached with exaggerated concern painted across his face. "Nurse Hayes," he said, his voice pitched to Carrie. "Dr. Whitfield was asking me to check on you. He thought you might need escort to your car for safety. You've been working such long hours, you know. Could be getting a little disoriented out there." The implication hung in the fluorescent-lit air like a physical thing. She was unstable, unreliable, unsafe, a liability to the institution that was graciously tolerating her presence. Natalie looked up from her charting. She met his eyes with the flat gaze of someone examining a specimen under glass. "No," she said. "Thank you." Then she returned to her documentation, her pen moving with the same mechanical precision it had been moving before he arrived. He stood there for 3 seconds, long enough for him to realize he'd been dismissed, long enough for her to make clear through silence that she would not be baited, would not justify, would not perform any of the emotional labor he was trying to demand from her. Then he left, his footsteps deliberate and slow, designed to communicate masculine offense at having been ignored. Natalie finished her charting and logged out of the system. She gathered her things from her locker on the 2nd floor, moving through the corridors with the same steady pace she'd maintained all day. At the very bottom of the locker, beneath her spare scrubs and the plastic container where she kept her lunch, sat the combat boots from Marjah. The leather was worn soft as skin by 18 years of use. The sole on the left boot had been resoled twice. The laces were the original black military-issue paracord, frayed at the ends where they'd been knotted 100 times. She knelt down and touched the leather, her fingers running across the scuff marks and the faded unit designation barely visible on the heel. Nobody knew about these boots. Nobody at St. Michael's had any idea that the woman they'd spent all day mocking had once worn them through a corridor in Kandahar while coordinating a medical evacuation under fire. That she had stumbled into a safe house with her left foot bleeding from shrapnel while the commander, the same commander now lying in room 347, had covered her exit with suppressive fire. She didn't pick them up. She just knelt there for a moment, letting the leather tell her its story. These boots had walked her through the worst 18 months of her life in a Pakistani cell where interrogators tried to break her into revealing the operation's details. They had walked out of the military entirely when she surfaced in a new identity with a new name and explicit orders to never speak of what she had survived. They were the only physical proof that Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes had ever existed at all. She closed the locker and walked toward the parking lot. The Portland evening had turned cool, that quality of late afternoon air that promised rain before midnight. Her car sat in the third row, silver and anonymous among dozens of other silver vehicles. She thought about what Whitfield had said during grand rounds, the confidence in his voice, the certainty that he could define her role in his institution. She thought about the resident smirks and the security guard's menacing concern and the physician's laughter dissolving in the air as if it had never existed. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Whitfield had no idea what was happening in room 347, no understanding of who Morrison really was or why she had ever learned sign language in the first place. The worst part was that her entire life before St. Michael's existed in classified files that the Navy would deny to her dying breath. He was playing checkers while she was holding the memory of war in her hands, and he would never know the difference. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone above the break room as Natalie pulled the billing folder from her locker at 2:08 a.m. The hospital had gone quiet, that particular silence that only comes when most people are asleep and the night shift belongs entirely to those willing to work in darkness. She spread the pages across the plastic table, her coffee long gone cold beside them, steam no longer rising from the cup. Room 347. General Wade Morrison. The charges didn't match the treatment records. She'd noticed it first by accident, a discrepancy in the surgical supplies log that made her pause. As a night shift nurse, she had access to billing reconciliation forms, a responsibility she'd taken seriously in all 8 months at St. Michael's. Most nurses never looked at them twice. Natalie looked at everything. That was the difference between someone who healed and someone who fixed problems before they festered. The first phantom procedure jumped out immediately. A cardiac catheterization listed for Morrison on March 12. She'd been his nurse that night. There had been no catheterization. Morrison had spent the evening signing with her about his grandson's rock commission, his vital signs stable, his chest completely untouched. She pulled the master chart. 18 charges. 18 procedures Morrison had never received, all routed through Medicare billing under Dr. Whitfield's authorization codes. An echocardiogram. A stress test. Coronary angiography. The dollar amounts climbed with the complexity, $847 here, $3,200 there, a $6,100 procedure that required overnight observation Morrison had never spent. The pattern was deliberate. Not sloppy. Not accidental. Deliberate. Natalie had survived on pattern recognition. In Marjah, in a safe house that wasn't safe, in interrogation rooms where the walls smelled like copper and concrete, pattern recognition was the difference between breathing and not breathing. This was the same kind of calculation. The same kind of predation. Just a different uniform. The total, spread across 5 months, was $94,700. Nearly $100,000 in fraudulent Medicare charges, each one carrying Whitfield's authorization signature, each one tracing back to a patient Natalie was now absolutely certain had been selected because he couldn't communicate with anyone except her. A deaf man. A retired general who signed, but whose chart said he was non-verbal. A man whose status made him invisible, perfect for billing that wouldn't be questioned because who would believe a general didn't notice he was being billed for procedures he'd never had? But he had noticed. Morrison had mentioned it in passing, his confusion about the discharge papers, the procedures listed on his summary that he'd never experienced. She'd dismissed it as confusion from medication, hadn't followed the thread. Until now. Until 2:36 a.m. in a break room that smelled like burnt coffee and the antiseptic soap dispensed from a chrome wall mount, Natalie understood what she was holding. Evidence. And a death sentence for her employment at St. Michael's. She photographed each page with her phone, a burner she kept for exactly these kinds of situations, the kind of precaution someone with her background never abandoned. The camera shutter was silent. Nothing left a trace on the hospital network. She documented the dates, the authorization codes, the patient account numbers. Her hands moved with the precision of someone trained in evidence preservation, evidence that would matter, evidence that had mattered in briefings that didn't exist and operations that had never happened. What they didn't know was that Natalie had already spent 16 years learning how systems worked, how institutions protected themselves, how money moved through channels, how a competent person with leverage could bury inconvenient truths in administrative paperwork. The morning arrived like a verdict. Natalie finished her shift at 7 a.m., returned to the locker room, showered the hospital smell from her skin, and dressed in her day clothes, dark jeans, grey scrubs top, the kind of uniform that made her invisible in hallways. She was reviewing a patient chart near the ICU when the administrative assistant appeared. "Dr. Whitfield wants to see you." His office. Now. The walk there felt like moving through water. Natalie's heartbeat remained steady, training held that at bay, but her mind was already calculating escape vectors, already thinking about severance negotiation, already running through the chain of custody on the evidence she'd documented. She'd made copies. Email forwarded to a secure server. 3 redundancies. 3 ways the truth would outlive her employment. Whitfield's office was exactly what she'd expected: mahogany desk, ego on the walls in framed diplomas, a window overlooking the parking lot where the morning light turned the asphalt the color of gunmetal. He didn't stand when she entered. He was holding a folder, the same thin folder she'd seen him reviewing with the residents during rounds yesterday. She'd noticed him glancing at her during his lectures, his smile knife blade sharp. "Natalie," he began, and the use of her first name was tactical, a false intimacy designed to disarm. "We need to discuss some concerns that have come up regarding your nursing approach." She said nothing. Waiting was a weapon too. 3 separate staff members have filed concerns about your intensity with patients. Your intensity? He opened the folder. The pages inside were sparse, typewritten, unsigned, or rather, signed by names she'd never seen before. The complaints were vague, emotional accusations without specifics. Boundary issues. Inappropriate communication. Overstepping. "I'm going to be removing you from General Morrison's care effective immediately." Natalie felt something shift behind her ribs. Not fear. The absence of fear, which was somehow worse. The absence of emotion was where the dangerous thoughts lived. "You'll be reassigned to post-surgical recovery," Whitfield continued. "Away from ICU. Your access to patient billing records is being restricted. That's beyond your scope as a bedside nurse." He was closing the net. Methodical. Calculated. Someone watching would have seen a confrontation between a doctor and a nurse. Someone listening carefully would have heard a predator removing the only witness to his feeding. "I understand," Natalie said. 8 letters distributed across 2 syllables, nothing in her voice, nothing in her face. Her hands rested on the chair arms, steady as surgical steel. Whitfield's frustration flickered. He'd been expecting resistance, emotion, something he could weaponize. Instead, he got silence. Instead, he got a woman sitting perfectly still, hands perfectly still, her eyes focused somewhere beyond him, focused on something he would never understand. "Good," he said finally, and his satisfaction was premature. "I'll have HR process the transfer. You start post-op rotation tomorrow." She was dismissed. She left without arguing, without pleading, without the small protests that might have made him feel powerful. Instead, she walked back into the corridors of St. Michael's knowing that the moment she'd walked out of his office, he'd activate every resource at his disposal. And he did. By noon, 2 board members had received calls. Natalie learned this later, piecing it together from fragments, overheard conversations in the hallway, the sudden absence of physicians who'd been friendly, the way people's eyes slid away from hers when she passed. Whitfield had spent years routing wealthy patients to their private practices, building a network of favors and reciprocal relationships. A few calls. A few gentle reminders about past courtesies. A few suggestions about what might happen if they didn't support a termination decision. By 2 p.m., an investigator named Corbett had appeared on the 4th floor, a man in a suit that cost more than Natalie made in a month, carrying a notebook and a practiced expression of concern. She watched him from the medication cart, watched him interview nurses, watched him build a narrative. She'd seen this before, the systematic construction of justification, the paper trail fabricated in reverse, starting with a conclusion and working backward to evidence that would support it. What they didn't know was that Natalie had already sent encrypted copies of the billing evidence to 3 separate email addresses. One at the Navy's Criminal Investigation Service. One at a journalist contact she'd cultivated years ago. One to a personal encrypted drive that would persist even if her phone was seized. But the worst part arrived at 5 p.m. Natalie approached the ICU badge reader, the electronic lock that required her proximity card to open the secured doors. She'd accessed this entrance 17 times already in her 8 months, every shift ending with a check on Morrison to make sure he was sleeping well, to sign goodnight in a language that made him feel seen. The door didn't unlock. Her badge, her access, had been revoked. Not suspended. Revoked. Complete removal from the ICU. No warning, no notification, just the small red light on the reader and the sound of the magnetic lock staying sealed. She looked through the window instead. Morrison's room was visible from the hallway. His monitor showed heart rate elevated, 140, maybe higher. His hand was moving, signing something to the nurse standing beside him, a young RN named Suzanne who stared blankly at his hands with the polite confusion of someone watching a language she didn't speak. Morrison's frustration was visible even from a distance. The monitor beeped faster. His breathing pattern changed. Compensation for stress. Early sympathetic activation. Something was wrong. The monitors were already showing it. And Natalie was locked outside. The code alarm screamed at 2:48 a.m. 3 sharp bursts through the hospital intercom, then a voice cutting through the static, code blue, room 347. Code blue, room 347. Natalie was 3 floors down in the ICU break room, hands wrapped around a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She didn't move at first. Just listened. The voice crackled again, cardiac arrest. All available personnel to 347. She was on her feet before conscious thought caught up. The coffee cup shattered on the linoleum floor, dark liquid spreading like spilled oil. Her badge, the one Whitfield had already flagged for removal, wouldn't unlock the stairwell door to the upper floors. She knew this. She ran anyway. The stairwell door stood at the far end of the corridor. Natalie moved toward it with the efficiency of someone who had operated on a much tighter clock than hospital protocol allowed. Her shift had exactly 4 hours remaining before security was scheduled to escort her out. For hours before her access terminated. For hours before Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes became invisible again. The stairwell door didn't budge. Red light on the electronic lock. She pressed her badge to the reader. Nothing. The mechanism hummed, denying her. Again, nothing. Behind her, the hospital breathed with the rhythm of a sleeping giant, fluorescent hum, distant monitor beeps, the soft squeak of shoes on polished tile. None of it mattered. Morrison was for minutes away from permanent silence, and she was locked behind a door. A janitor emerged from an adjacent room, pushing a cart laden with cleaning supplies. He saw her standing there, hand still on the badge reader, shoulders coiled tight as a snare drum. He saw the look on her face, not panic, but something harder. Calculation. He didn't know who she was. He just knew that expression meant someone was running out of time. He propped the stairwell door open with his cart. Didn't ask. Didn't hesitate. The door swung wide on its hinges. Natalie moved through it without acknowledgement. She took the stairs 3 at a time, her footsteps echoing like artillery fire in the concrete shaft. Her calves burned. Her heart rate climbed. Neither mattered. Time was the only metric that counted now, and she was losing it by the second. Up for flights. Her legs remembered worse, sand in desert heat, ammunition weight distributed across her chest, carrying a man twice her size toward a medevac chopper with rounds snapping past her ear. Room 347 was controlled chaos. A resident stood frozen beside the bed, paging cardiology on the phone like the words alone could summon a cardiologist from thin air. 2 nurses were performing chest compressions in the synchronized rhythm of practiced desperation, 30 compressions, 2 breaths, repeat until the heart remembers how to beat on its own. An oxygen mask hung over Morrison's face. The monitors above his bed painted a portrait of catastrophic failure. The heart rhythm had degraded into a flat line, undulating only with the force of external compression. But the monitors told a deeper story if you knew how to read them. Natalie read them in a single glance. Morrison's blood pressure was collapsing. The veins in his neck were distended, swollen with pressure building inside a space that should have been hollow. His chest wasn't rising with oxygen delivery. His lungs weren't accepting air. The problem wasn't his heart rhythm. The problem was underneath his ribs. Cardiac tamponade, she said. Not a question. A diagnosis delivered with the authority of someone who had made this call before, in conditions far more hostile than a sterile hospital room. The resident turned. His eyes went wide. You're not, your badge. Is the ultrasound machine in this room? Room 340, but you can't. She was already moving. 30 seconds to 340. Another 30 to position the machine, wheel it back, plug in the probe. The resident had abandoned his phone mid-sentence. He watched as Natalie placed the ultrasound transducer against Morrison's skin, tilting the angle with the fluid precision of someone who had performed this exact maneuver with nothing but moonlight and the sound of distant gunfire as her operating theater. The screen flickered. There it was. The pericardial sac, the membrane surrounding the heart, filled with dark fluid. 60 milliliters minimum, maybe more. Blood. The effusion was crushing Morrison's heart, collapsing the chambers, preventing the organ from doing the one thing it was designed to do, beat. The resident was pale as surgical gauze. We need cardiothoracic surgery. I'll call. No time. Natalie moved to the crash cart without breaking stride. Her hands were already moving, selecting a needle, 14 gauge, long enough to penetrate the chest wall and reach the pericardial sac beneath the xiphoid process. She prepped the site with antiseptic that smelled like ammonia and institutional precision. The fluid was warm against her fingertips. "What are you doing?" the resident asked, but his voice had changed. It wasn't a question anymore. It was recognition. The kind of recognition that only came from watching someone operate at a level that transcended protocol. That transcended normal human coordination. She inserted the needle. One fluid motion. The kind of motion that required 2 things, knowledge and muscle memory. Knowledge she'd earned from textbooks. Muscle memory she'd earned in the mountains of Afghanistan, in the back of a truck while the world fell apart around her, in the darkness of a cell in Marjah where time had moved in units of heartbeats and shallow breaths. The needle found the pericardial sac. Serous fluid rushed into the syringe, dark, blood-tinged, 60 milliliters of pressure that had been slowly suffocating the general's heart. She drew it back deliberately. Controlled. The monitors behind them began to climb, 58. 62, 70. Oxygen saturation rising. The heart rhythm starting to restore itself from the pressure release. Morrison's blood pressure stabilized at 92/56. Not perfect, but alive. The kind of alive that meant a cardiothoracic surgeon could take over, could address the underlying cause of the bleeding, could turn this man's life back into something more than a collection of vital signs declining toward zero. The resident stared at Natalie as if she had materialized from another dimension. His lips moved but no words emerged. His hands were trembling, the trembling that came from watching a code reverse itself through pure skill. Through something beyond protocol. Through something that spoke to a part of medical training that lived only in the most specialized units of the most advanced military medical programs. The kind of programs that didn't exist on any civilian resume. "Get cardio down here," Natalie said. "Now." The resident moved. He picked up the phone with hands that didn't quite obey. He made the call. His voice shook as he reported the case. Pericardial effusion. Resolved. Patient stabilized. Natalie stepped back from the bed. Her heart rate was already declining, the physiological reset that came from crisis resolution. She had been here before. She would likely be here again, though the next time it happened, it would be in a context that didn't exist yet, in a location that hadn't been determined, in a life that hadn't been authorized. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today's problem was standing in the doorway. Dr. Whitfield arrived 20 minutes later, his face a landscape of barely suppressed fury. He took in the scene, Morrison stable, oxygen flowing, the cardiac tamponade resolved, and Natalie standing beside the crash cart with her hands empty and her expression blank as a hospital wall. He didn't speak. His jaw worked silently, processing the fact that his timeline had been disrupted, that the general had survived, that his plan to eliminate Natalie before she could expose the billing fraud had encountered a complication named emergency procedure outside standard scope of practice. He smiled. It was a predator's smile. By dawn, Whitfield had activated his full network. The two board members confirmed over early morning coffee that they would sign off on immediate termination. The investigator, the same man who had buried 3 prior complaints against Whitfield's conduct, delivered a fabricated file claiming Natalie had substance abuse concerns, sourced from interviews with staff members Whitfield had paid to corroborate the narrative. The state licensing board received a phone call at 6:44 a.m., before most of the hospital staff had arrived for the morning shift. She performed an emergency pericardiocentesis, Whitfield told the licensing official, his voice lined with concerned professionalism. Without physician supervision. Without proper certification. This is grossly outside her scope of practice. The patient could have been harmed. This is reckless endangerment, and I have a responsibility to report it. The official asked for documentation. Whitfield provided it, his own written account, the substance abuse file, and a statement from the resident claiming that Natalie had ordered him to step back from the code. A lie so clean and simple that it had the texture of truth. By noon, Natalie was summoned to human resources. The office smelled like burnt coffee and the particular brand of institutional dread that preceded terminations. The HR director, a woman named Patricia who had never made eye contact with Natalie once in 8 months, slid a termination letter across the desk. The charges were specific. Performing procedures beyond nursing scope of practice. Insubordination. Boundary violations. The letter stated that her employment was terminated effective immediately. All hospital credentials revoked. All access suspended. All badge authorizations cancelled within the hour. Security escorted her to her locker. The hallway was empty, the staff had been warned away by HR, the kind of warning that turned terminations into public spectacles for those who knew how to read the signals. Natalie opened her locker and removed the worn combat boots from Marjah. She held them for 5 seconds. 5 seconds in which her hands didn't tremble and her face didn't betray the calculation running beneath her composure like an underground river. 5 seconds of pure decision. Then she placed the boots in her bag. Her badge came next. She placed it on the shelf inside the locker. She didn't hand it to the security guard standing 3 feet away. She just left it there, a small act of control in a moment when control had been systematically dismantled. Whitfield watched from his office window for floors above, his silhouette dark against the glass. He was satisfied. The threat was eliminated before she could connect his lake house to the phantom procedures, before she could link his daughter's medical school tuition to the fraudulent Medicare billing that had funded it, before she could articulate the specific dollar amounts that would have required federal investigation. The general was alive. Whitfield couldn't prevent that without making himself complicit in the crime. But the person who knew about the crime, the person who could testify, the person who had the military background to understand exactly how the billing codes had been manipulated, she was now radioactive. Terminated. Discredited. The military couldn't help her. Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes was dead on paper. She had been declared deceased following the Marjah operation, her entire service record classified, her identity legally dissolved to protect diplomatic relations and operational security. She had been given a new social security number, a new background, a new existence as a civilian nurse with a 7-year employment history and no military connection. Resurfacing meant violating direct orders. It meant exposing operations that the Navy had sworn would remain classified. It meant creating a diplomatic incident that could destabilize an entire region. She had been ordered never to surface. At 3:12 a.m., 3 hours after the termination became final, after the hospital had returned to its ordinary rhythms of suffering and healing, Natalie sat alone in an all-night diner on 82nd Avenue. The coffee in front of her had gone cold an hour ago. The waitress had stopped offering refills. The neon from the parking lot outside cast everything in shades of cold blue and institutional yellow. Natalie stared at her reflection in the dark window, a woman with steady eyes and a face that had learned not to advertise its interior weather. She had disappeared once. The Navy had made that happen. They had erased her and given her a new name, a new life, a new identity built on lies that went all the way up to the Pentagon. Disappearing twice felt like a different kind of erasure. A final one. But the boots were in her bag. The boots from Marjah. The boots that had walked through fire and emerged on the other side, and they were here in this diner, in this booth, in this cold moment where the world seemed to be happening in some other room, some other universe, some other version of a life where Morrison didn't wake up tomorrow and realize exactly who had saved his life. The rain started outside. Soft at first, then harder, until it was hammering the parking lot like applause from an audience that would never identify itself. At 3 in the morning, the diner on 82nd Avenue was a fluorescent chapel for the insomniac and the broken. Natalie Hayes sat in a booth near the back window, her hospital badge deactivated on the table beside a coffee cup gone cold an hour ago. Rain hammered the glass like applause from an audience that would never identify itself. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman with steady hands and a face that had learned to hide everything, now watching herself disappear for the second time. The first disappearance had been by order. The second was by choice. Or so she thought. She didn't know that 340 miles away in a federal field office, General Wade Morrison was making phone calls that would change the trajectory of her erasure. She didn't know that the photograph he'd been keeping, the one showing her son in his uniform, shrapnel wound bandaged, her holding his hand in a military hospital in Kandahar, was being entered into evidence. She didn't know that every medical record she'd ever kept sealed, every procedure she'd performed under names that didn't exist, every deployment she'd been ordered to forget, was being unsealed right now under Morrison's authority. What she knew was that her locker at St. Michael's had been cleared by security while Dr. Whitfield watched from his office window, satisfied that he'd eliminated the threat before she could connect the billing irregularities to his lake house and his daughter's medical school tuition. What she knew was that she was a ghost twice over, and ghosts don't have lawyers. The waitress refilled her cup without asking. Natalie nodded. Gratitude that required no words. She pressed her palm against the cold window and felt the vibration of the rain, thought about her son, thought about Morrison in that hospital bed breathing oxygen she'd made certain would flow. The boots were still in her car. The only physical thing left from a life the military had ordered her to erase. She should burn them. She should burn them and scatter the ashes and finally be free. But she didn't burn them. She would never burn them. The black SUVs arrived at St. Michael's the following morning at 8:16 a.m., before shift change, before the first wave of attending physicians arrived for rounds. 2 soldiers in dress uniforms walked past reception, their bearing so precise it made the air pressure change in the lobby. They asked for Longshot. Just that. Just the call sign that made the veteran security guard's face go pale, made him stammer. Master Chief Petty Officer Hayes was, "She's the nurse they fired." The soldiers didn't correct him. They didn't need to. By 8:53 a.m., the hospital administrator was in the main lobby trying to look official. By 8:55 a.m., Dr. Whitfield appeared, his white coat pristine, his expression still confident, still certain that authority in a teaching hospital translated to authority everywhere else. He was wrong. Dead wrong. General Morrison appeared in a wheelchair pushed by a Navy physician's assistant, still weak, still visibly marked by 3 days of cardiac complications, but his eyes were moving like a man conducting an orchestra. His jaw worked as if he were speaking without sound, and the interpreter beside him waited, poised to translate whatever came next into words that would reshape this entire hospital. A Navy captain opened a folder. His voice was level, the voice of someone reading from documents that had been classified until approximately 45 minutes ago. Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. 18 combat deployments. For citations for Valor. 2 Purple Hearts. Bronze Star. Silver Star. He paused between medals like punctuation marks, letting each one land. Battlefield Surgical Certification from the Naval Special Warfare Command. Emergency trauma training exceeding most attending physicians. Medical Clearance Level TSSCI, Special Compartmented Information. 3 tours to Kandahar. 4 tours to Helmand Province. 2 tours to Loga. 1 classified operation in Marjah that resulted in her recommendation for the Navy Cross, declined by her request for continued operational security. Whitfield's face had gone the color of old teeth. The board members who had promised him their support yesterday were now studying the marble floor with sudden intensity. Morrison's hands moved, his fingers precise as surgery. The interpreter spoke words that had been prepared, rehearsed, signed with the weight of command. She took shrapnel meant for my son, your son, and spent 2 years in a Pakistani cell so the mission wouldn't be compromised, and you fired her for saving my life the same way she saved his. The room went dead silent. The fluorescent light seemed to buzz louder in the absence of human sound. A nurse 3 feet away forgot she was holding a medication tray. Whitfield opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again like a man drowning in air. This is absurd. She performed a procedure outside her scope of. She was credentialed for that procedure in Kandahar, Fallujah, and Marjah, the Navy captain interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen things that made hospital protocol seem like a child's game of pretend. Her medical clearance exceeds yours, Doctor. Significantly. Whitfield pivoted. His voice went sharp, desperate now, pulling at threads. Then why was she working as a nurse under a false identity? This is fraud. This is some kind of. The captain opened another folder. Master Chief Hayes was operating under federal witness protection equivalent after a classified operation. Her presence here was authorized at the federal level. Yours is about to be questioned. And that's when the doors opened. The FBI agents entered through the automatic entrance, their bearing identical to the soldiers, their authority territorial and absolute. 3 of them. The lead agent's name was Harrison, and he carried a laptop that displayed a series of photographs, the same photographs Natalie had taken 17 days ago when she'd reviewed the billing codes. The phantom procedures. The inflated charges. The Medicare fraud that had netted Whitfield approximately $340,000 over the past 18 months. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, Harrison said, holding up the documentation, we have evidence you attempted to forge federal personnel records to justify termination of a protected witness. You accessed databases without authorization and falsified documentation to manufacture cause for firing. We also have evidence of Medicare fraud totaling $340,000 over the past 18 months. Whitfield had tried to alter Natalie's file in the hospital system, not realizing her records were flagged at the federal level. Any access triggered an immediate alert. His login had pinged the Pentagon the moment he'd opened her file to change the dates of her employment history. The Pentagon had watched him attempt the forgery in real time. The Pentagon had documented every keystroke. You also submitted fraudulent claims using patient billing codes, Harrison continued, showing the photographs. These images were provided to federal investigators 3 days ago by General Morrison. Your network of board members, supervisors, and hired investigators have all begun cooperating with our office. The investigator you hired, Mr. Vasquez, called our field office at 6:16 a.m. this morning and provided documentation of your requests to bury complaints dating back to 2019. The board members were backing away now, literally moving toward the walls as if proximity to Whitfield had become contagious. "We barely knew him," one muttered. "Met him at a fundraiser maybe once." "Dr. Whitfield, you're under arrest for fraud, unauthorized access to federal records, and filing false documentation with the state licensing board." Harrison produced handcuffs. Not the theatrical kind. The real kind. The kind that made a sound like finality. Whitfield was scarlet now, his veins bulging at his temples, his mouth opening and closing as words tried to form and died before they reached his teeth. The perp walk through the lobby took exactly 47 seconds. Every resident who had smirked at sign language Sally watched him pass. Every nurse who had whispered in hallways witnessed his humiliation. Every physician who had doubted her was there to see his face as the automatic doors closed behind him like a mouth swallowing. 2 years later, the scene was different. Natalie Hayes stood in navy dress whites in a Pentagon ceremony room with ceilings so high they seemed to belong to another country. Her uniform bore the insignia of Master Chief Petty Officer, restored, unsealed, no longer operating under any name but her own. The room held 214 people. Dignitaries. Active duty officers. Navy SEALs from her old unit. The 75th Ranger Regiment, represented. The Night Stalkers from the 160th SAW. General Morrison, promoted and returned to active advisory duty, stood beside her, stood as much as a man holding a walker could stand. His hands were steady, though. His eyes were clear. The medal hung before her like a question that was about to be answered. The Navy Cross. The medal she had declined 18 years ago, requesting instead that her name remain classified, her operation remain buried, her son remain safe. The medal they were presenting to her now because her son had asked for it. Her son, who was a major now, who had watched his mother disappear and reappear and disappear again, and who had finally said, "No more." Morrison's hands moved. The interpreter spoke, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes has proven that in the darkest places on Earth. In caves in Kandahar. In villages in Helmand. In a cell in Marjah. And in a hospital corridor where she chose to save a life when she had every right to let it end. He paused. "Pin the medal, General." The medal pinned against her chest with a soft click. Cameras flashed. The audience rose. 214 people standing, applauding, and Natalie held perfectly still, her eyes forward, her composure absolute, her hands at her sides. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply received what had been withheld for 18 years and accepted it the way she accepted everything, with the quiet knowledge that class isn't about winning. Class is about who you are when nobody's watching. 300 miles away in Portland, Dr. Marcus Whitfield taught CPR certification at Mercy Community College for $18 an hour. His medical license was suspended. His legal fees were mounting. His daughter's medical school tuition remained unpaid. He taught seniors and teenagers who mostly weren't listening, who mostly forgot the chest compression rhythm the moment they left the classroom. Sometimes, between classes, he stared at his phone and thought about calling someone who might help. But there was nobody left to call. The board members had forgotten his name. The investigator had testified against him. The colleagues who'd promised support had disavowed him within 36 hours. He was what remained when authority was stripped away, just a man teaching a skill to people who would never need it, in a room that smelled like old coffee and regret. At St. Michael's Hospital, Natalie's photograph hung in the intensive care unit. Not as a nurse. Not anymore. As the hospital's new director of emergency medicine. She had completed her medical degree on the GI Bill benefits the Navy had retroactively restored, had passed the boards with scores that made the faculty stop and recheck the numbers, and had been hired 2 months before her graduation because the hospital's administration wanted to make sure she couldn't be poached by anyone else. The first policy she implemented was mandatory sign language training for all staff. The second policy was the removal of Dr. Marcus Whitfield's photograph from the physician directory. They simply removed it. No announcement. No explanation. Just absent. General Morrison visited the hospital monthly. He and Natalie would sit in the hospital chapel when her shift ended, sitting in silence mostly, but sometimes signing to each other about her son, about Marjah, about the things that don't need words. He'd push the envelope across the table and she'd open it, letters from soldiers she'd saved, from families who had gotten to keep their mothers and fathers, from her son telling her how proud he was. She'd nod. She'd fold the letters and put them away. She'd never say thank you because Morrison had not done this to be thanked. Morrison had done this because competence deserves recognition and sacrifice deserves witness. The worn combat boots from Marjah sat in a shadow box on the wall above her desk. Beside them, a photograph, her son in his army uniform, shrapnel wound bandaged, her hand on his shoulder. The boots had never been cleaned. The dust from helm and province still clung to the leather. The blood stain on the left heel had never been washed away. She kept them exactly as they were because a promise kept isn't about perfection. It's about remembering that someone bled so that someone else could live. If you've made it this far, you know that the quiet ones are always the most dangerous. Subscribe, like, and tell me, what would you have done in Natalie's position? Would you have walked away, or would you have bled?